Juan Watterson. I'm standing in the constituency of Rushen.
Why is it that you have decided to seek re-election?
Well, I must admit, I love my job. I qualified as a chartered accountant, but the prospect of going off and earning big money in the private sector compared to representing a constituency such as Rushen, doing the public service, helping people and being just embedded in a part of the island that I know and love so well, has been a consistent draw for me for the last 15 years, and it's something that I'd like to carry on doing for another 5.
Well, looking back at your manifesto from 5 years ago, various different bits and pieces in there. One of the issues that you highlighted was the public election for Legislative Council. That's obviously not something we've seen. Are you disappointed that there hasn't been that constitutional change?
No, I think we've had the functioning of Tynwald Committee, and that debate has been given a good airing. I mean, we've seen there's lots of different ways of running Legislative Council. There's lots of different ways of electing them either by the Keys or the public. I think there's always the danger of giving a mandate, but what's been really interesting in the evolution of the Legislative Council is that instead of it being perhaps something that politicians have at the end of their career, it's seeming to be something that they're doing at the start of the career these days. And whether that's a good thing or not, time will tell. I think it's really important, though, with Legislative Council, we get a balance of talent, balance of abilities in terms of political experience, in terms of fresh faces. And it's going to take some time, I think, to settle down. But one thing I would always like to see is someone who has been a former MHK in there, and because I think that's an essential ingredient within the Legislative Council.
Well, you stood for president a couple of weeks ago. Is it a route that you'd look to take going into LegCo?
In terms of, well, that would probably be the only way I would probably go into Legislative Council. Although, a Legislative Council is for those people who have a real experience and interest in the legislation, something that's doesn't always get the time that I think it deserves with a lot of members of the House of Keys. I think it's all too easy for members, especially new members, to get caught up in the whirl of government policy and press releases and department work and forget that actually the core purpose of us being there in the House of Keys is passing legislation. And that is something that's always been a real interest to me. So the legislation is so important, and that's the skills that you're looking for in Legislative Council, wherever they come from.
Another one of your 2016 manifesto issues was budget reform, and this is something you brought to Tynwald just last month. It didn't get the supports. Were you disappointed by that?
Incredibly disappointed, yeah. I thought it would have done far better. I think the way that the motion was ultimately put didn't help, and I think it would have got more support had it been broken down into parts, but that move was obviously opposed by council and ministers. I think there is a move out there that wants more accountability for public money. The interesting thing about budget reform is that it means that politicians ourselves have to take responsibility, because if you are going to be able to put down amendments, you have to be able to own them and be able to justify them. And I suppose in the way it's easier at the moment to just take it or leave it. It's a pretty binary choice rather than the more difficult things about listening to public opinion and informing a budget debate in advance, because of course the public have absolutely no input into this process at all at the moment. And I think that's the bit that I find that most disappointing, that there seems to be a lack of willingness to really seize on, although there are, I say, many other parts of the system that I think are desperately in need of reform in terms of the budget.
So would that be a priority for you for the next 5 years if you are to be re-elected, to revisit this issue?
Yes, absolutely. It's something that I feel very strongly about. I have done for a long time. I'd hope to encourage members to read the Commonwealth benchmarks of democratic legislatures, to think carefully about the process by which we allocate £1.2 billion of public money, to make sure that it's something that they can look people in the eye and say that is a fair system that gives good outcomes. And when we're spending £70 million a year on capital projects that Tynwald members really get no say in, then I just don't think that is a reasonable process.
You did also highlight the economy as a big issue last time. You talked about work permits, tax, planning rules. Has this been given enough of a priority by this administration?
I'll give this administration its due. I think that they've done an awful lot to make sure that there is still an economy there post-pandemic, and that is something that I think that they can look back with a degree of pride. These are all matters that involve carefully balancing and nuancing, although it's reassuring to see that actually already just a few months out of the last lockdown, and even with numbers surging, we are still seeing unemployment coming down, and it's almost back at pre-COVID levels. So I do think there is a lot to be said for the resilience of the Manx economy already.
And probably your best known title over the last 5 years has been Speaker of the House of Keys. What was it that drew you to that role?
So many things about that role that I really enjoyed. One is about a leadership role in terms of educating and informing members and being able to take that parliamentary leadership role. That's been something that I've really, really enjoyed. Setting up the continual professional development programme for members has been a particular amount of pride, because that a raising tide raises all boats, and the better that all the parliamentarians can be, the better the outcomes for the people of this island. I've also found it really liberating for my constituents. I've been able to speak out on behalf of my constituents in a way that I found really quite frustrating when I was in the Council of Ministers, when you have to toe the party line, and that frustration has gone away. And it's also given me, with the experience that I have and being in that role, that sort of helicopter view of government, to be able to join dots, which maybe they don't see within Council of Ministers, and be able to offer recommendations using things such as the Public Accounts Committee and also the Poverty Committee. I mean, something that I saw at the last election was this big difference between the haves and the have-nots in Manx society, and the Poverty Committee was the outcome of that. And we've seen some really, really good work in there, and recommendations that were overwhelmingly supported in Tynwald in July. That's going to mean that things such as 16% of the Manx workforce are going to be actually paid a wage that they can afford to live on, moving up the minimum wage up to the living wage. And I think that's going to be a tremendously big social shift on the island, meaning that people can actually afford to live here. That's going to be so important. Things such as a wider availability for school meals, trying to give that opportunity for realistic decision making to be happening on the ground, rather than making sure that the bureaucracy fills in first. These are sort of all sort of cultural changes and systemic changes that cut across so many areas of government, and that's the benefit of having someone with experience sitting outside of council ministers, but in that sort of influential role.
We talked about some of the difficulties of being in the Council of Ministers when you were a minister. Does that mean you wouldn't want to revisit the role of minister in the next administration? I'm not saying I wouldn't. I'd say I'd take some persuading, because I did find it really quite a challenge in that environment. I was lucky I had a great department in Home Affairs, something that I was able to sort of set a mark on and set a direction for, and some of the legislation that was started in that administration has come through Minister Malarkey and Minister Crogene, really to have delivered some really sort of heavyweight pieces of legislation. But I did find it an oppressive environment. I think that Council Ministers is an organ that does need to change a bit before I would ever want to seek to go back into it. We saw one minister lose his job in this administration for going against the collective vote. Is that something that needs looking at? That's
part of it. I think the culture of decision making, the way that the culture of Council Ministers and its sort of very sort of defensive culture, its block voting culture, I think it's something that does need a bit of challenge. It's something that sometimes becomes deaf to good ideas from outside if it's not invented here. Although that's as much about perhaps some of the personalities as it is about some of the systems. So it's a difficult one.
You would be one of the most long-standing members in the next government. Would you, or in the next administration, would you want to put yourself forward for Chief Minister?
No.
Absolutely not?
I wouldn't want to. No, the closer I've got to that job, I have to say the less I've coveted it. There are plenty of people who are desperate to climb to the top of the greasy pole. I've never been one of them. If my colleagues wanted me and 12 of them came to me and said, Jim, we want you to be Chief Minister, then obviously I would. But it's not a job that I would actively go out and covet, no.
But you wouldn't want someone who is just desperate for it, surely? It would need to be the right person.
Yeah, although I think if you've got somebody who was had that mandate, had somebody who was keen to put a team together, that would be more advantageous. I'm not sure if that's something that, given my disagreements with the present council ministers and how many of them will be rolling over into the new one, whether that would be practical or not.
Well, looking ahead to the next 5 years, we asked you to fill out a little bit of a survey. We asked you to pick your top 3 issues from a list. One of the ones you picked out was climate change. Why was that?
It always has been one of my priorities. If you go back to my manifestos all the way back to 2006, you'll have found that energy and climate change have been part of my manifestos. It's great that it's getting more mainstream support these days than it was then, and certainly felt that I was bashing my head against a bit of a brick wall back in the early days with this. But there is a real culture shift now, and one of the great optimisms I have for the coming administration is looking around colleagues in there. There's an overwhelming desire to really get on with some of the changes that are needed in our housing, in our energy production, in our lifestyles, and bringing those to the fore and making them happen on this island. And I have a huge amount of optimism that that is going to happen in the next 5 years.
Another issue you highlighted in your top 3 as well, which I know was on your manifesto in 2016, was roads. Why was that?
Well, we all know what the state of the island's roads are like, especially outside of Douglas and the promenade. And one of the real frustrations I've had in recent years is that rural roads budget that goes to do much needed projects like Portsmouth Mary High Street just haven't been done because that money has been swallowed up and tipped into the promenade. Now, I'm not saying the promenade didn't need doing, whether it's been done efficiently or not. I think, Mrs. Barber and Mr. Roberts, the infrastructure committee, have done a great job in keeping tabs on that. But really, that shouldn't have been to the detriment of the roads elsewhere on the Isle of Man. And if that had meant that it took a bit longer or cost a bit more to make sure that both were being done, I think there'd be a lot more happiness out there in the community, because it's when people see their local roads going to pot for the sake of the promenade, I think that's what really grates.
Can it be a bit Douglas-centric at times when it comes to making decisions like that?
Yeah, as I say, it's not that the promenade didn't need doing. It is a big project. I think more people would probably say that it was TT course-centric than it was Douglas-centric. But there is no real justification for allowing the roads outside of those, say, the TT course and Douglas Promenade, get worse over the last 5 years. I think, and I know it's been a product of just having just about every construction worker on the Isle of Man down on Douglas Promenade, but I think that that's what's really grated with people, is seeing their own roads get a lot worse just for this one project.
Affordable housing is another issue you selected. Is that something within your constituency, or is that an island-wide issue? It's
both, but certainly it's an island-wide issue. I think we are seeing at the moment something of a price bubble in the property market, and we're not seeing wages rise to meet that. So it is proving hard at the moment. I'm not got a crystal ball, but I do think that might be a bit of a bubble as supply chains have been disrupted, materials prices are higher, and there is a massive call for labour in the construction sector at the moment. So it is really overheating at the moment, and hopefully over the next 2 years that will improve. But that's something that needs more government work on, more active work in terms of looking at the policies around social housing, around how we build and the housing mix of social housing, to make sure that that's fit for purpose, to make sure that we have schemes that allow affordability, but also making sure that we actually have the ability to build new houses, because that's what it's going to take. If we've got a thriving economy as we do, we are going to need to build those houses for Manx families to go into.
We also asked you if you wanted to add in any of your other issues. One you selected was size of government. What's the problem there? Is it too big, too large? Where's the excess?
It's far too big. One of the challenges that we were set after the global financial crisis was to slim down government. And I think I was possibly the only minister to actually achieve it. We cut, at that time, 25% out of the budget, at Home Affairs 14% out of the headcount. So it's really galling to see over the last 5 years that the size of government has gone up from a little over 8,000 to 8,500. Now, some of that is COVID specific, the track and trace teams and the other organisations that have had to be created to manage borders and 111 and that sort of side of things. But there still needs to be a balancing, because 8,500 people out of a total workforce of a little over 40,000 people is just not sustainable in the long term. So we do need to look hard at what things in government we should do, and the bits that need to be done either differently or not done at all.
How do you make cuts, though, without impacting the taxpayer, without taking away services?
You can't always. And sometimes that is about having that conversation as to how much we need something to be done, whether we need it to be done in the same way, the same standard, or to the same timescales. And that's part of the the ambition of trying to get the Auditor General, so someone who has a sort of similar skill set to the one I've been trying to bring to the Public Accounts Committee, but have them there full time with a task of identifying savings of 3 times the cost of running the office. That's their mandate, and that will really help, I think, government and Parliament come together and identify those savings going forward.
We've touched on it a bit already, but how would you assess government's performance over the last 5 years?
I think it's been a sort of 3-year administration, really, instead of a 5-year administration. I'd say a lot of the big promises that were made early on remain unfulfilled. Things such as rates reform, some of the more challenging questions have been dodged. And then in the last 2 years, obviously the pandemic has been the overwhelming factor. I think the response was really good, really positive at the start. The lockdowns were widely accepted. I think that, as many people know, I'm not a fan of the borders opening when they did. I voted against that happening in June. I would have rather have seen them wait until the school holidays started, another 4 to 6 weeks before the borders opened, just to give people that time to adjust and prepare, but also to spare the kids the being sat in a petri dish for the last couple of weeks of term and giving them that sort of certainty. So that was my principal difference in terms of policy with government the last sort of few weeks.
What would you have done differently, though? Aside from obviously the borders, but generally over the last 5 years?
I think we need to... I don't think a lot of the groundwork has been done on some of the issues. I mean, another one was the government had said that they were going to do a lot more about debt and how government treated its own debt and making sure that they had a toolkit that was fit for purpose in collecting it. Instead, we've seen government writing off millions of pounds a year in uncollected money that it is owed by suppliers, by taxpayers. And again, they had this is something that was raised in my first term when we wrote a report on it in the Public Accounts Committee then. It just doesn't seem to have happened, and that's a real frustration. So it's about actually sort of getting some of this legislation through. And whilst it might not be terribly popular, I think one of the things that I'd have done differently, which I think was the subject of my first question to the Chief Minister in this administration, was employing more legislative drafters, because you are not going to get some of these big changes through unless you employ the people to write the laws to change them. It takes ages to get the laws passed on this island. It takes far, far too long. We've got 5 years. We're still waiting for an animal welfare bill. There are so many areas that you are not going to be able to change without changes in the law. Capacity is another one. This is stuff that is known to be needed. It's known what's wanted, and it's just not getting delivered. And so whilst employing more lawyers might not be a very popular move, it is what's going to be needed if we're going to really achieve the sort of social and economic changes that are called for.
We've talked about some of your priorities for the next 5 years already, but what about in Rushen? What is the main priority within the constituency?
Well, I've been out knocking on, I think I've done almost 900 doors so far, and primarily around Portsmouth. So you can imagine that the state of Portsmouth High Street has been pretty high up on the agenda. The other one, I say I'm really pleased to hear that is getting far more mainstream focus, is about climate change, is about how we generate energy on the Isle of Man, is about how we help people improve their own homes, how they get around the island. Those are other significant issues that are going to take a lot more focus in the next 5 years. And as I say, looking at the people who are standing, the agendas that they're standing on, and their history, I'm really quite positive that it's going to be a far different place when it comes to looking at energy and climate change on this island in the next administration.
Okay, we have
one I hope to be a part of.
We have nearly managed 20 minutes, so just finally, if someone does vote for you, what are they getting? What do you promise?
Well, I can't promise deliverables. What I can promise is to work with the same honesty, diligence, passion, integrity and commitment that I have done over the last 15 years. In me, you'll find somebody who is deeply rooted in the constituency of Rushen and finds a real passion in serving that community.